so happy to welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show Professor Jonathan Turley. You see Professor Turley on the Fox News channel. He's got this great new book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage, which I inhaled over the last week. And, you know, I've been teaching con law since 1996, Professor Turley, and I learned a lot. That is one hell of a recommendation for people, because I've been taking Michael John and I've been using Jeffrey Stone and Irwin and a lot for a long time, and I still learned a lot. So congratulations, it's shooting up the bestseller list. Are you surprised that Americans are hungry for the indispensable right?
Well, first of all, Hugh, I've been looking forward to this interview because you are one of the most knowledgeable and greatest defenders of free speech and the free press in our industry. And you and I have been around the block many, many times. And so this is really an extraordinary opportunity for me. I really appreciate it. I'm delighted by how well the book is doing. It's out of the norm now. You know, there are a number of anti-free speech books out there by professors, including books calling for the rewriting of the First Amendment. One of my colleagues has actually drafted up language that is being heralded on NPR and other outlets that is meant to rewrite the First Amendment because it's, quote, excessively individualistic, to allow free speech to be censored to protect equity and social reforms. That is not a minority position. I'm in the minority. I'm something of a dinosaur within the academy. This book is likely to receive a lot of barbs from my colleagues around the country because it advances a view of free speech that it's a natural right, that it doesn't come from the government. It is a natural right that belongs to all human beings, that completes us as human beings. And that was the view that existed at the beginning of our republic. We had this moment of clarity. Perhaps the most revolutionary part of the American Revolution was how we defined free speech. And that was embodied in the First Amendment. And as given the movement to amend or curtail the First Amendment today, it's still revolutionary. But we lost that. It was the original sin of the American Republic. Within a few years, early American judges re-embraced the Blackstonian or English view of free speech. And I call that a functionalist view of free speech, that they viewed free speech as being protected to the extent that it helps democracy.
Now, Professor Turley, this is an interview, not a debate, so I'm not going to interview fine points of the law. I do want to declare my priors, though. I have to let you know that John Eastman and Erwin Chemerinsky are old broadcast friends of mine. John Eastman was my dean for a long time. I participated in his hiring at Chapman. He was a fine dean and a great mind. Erwin and John came on this program almost weekly for 20 years. And Judge David Carter is a dear personal friend of mine. So while I appreciate, it's the first time I've seen anyone in print talk about Eastman versus Thompson, I won't talk about it because I don't talk about old colleagues, either John or Erwin, and I don't talk about friends who are on the bench like Judge Carter, but I compliment you for diving into it. I just wanted to add one detail to the irony. Not only did John and Erwin do a weekly appearance here, they've been replaced now by Steve Laddick and Jonathan Alter over at Case Western, Jonathan Adler at Case Western. But when Erwin was hired at UCI as the dean of the UCI Law School, he was promptly fired when there was a blowback. And the two people who defended him and I believe got him his job back were named Hugh Hewitt and John Eastman. That is not known to anyone, and Erwin has basically abandoned John Eastman. You haven't. I can't defend John because I have a conflict. You did, and I just want to say thank you. At the very end of the book, and Judge Carter's a good friend of mine, and you take him to task for his opinion, but boy, you're the first one. Have you seen anybody else talk about that case?
No, you know, the Academy, as you know, acts as a group of lemmings. You know, once you are sort of tagged, everyone flees. That's been the case in higher education. The book talks about our current anti-free speech movement as the most dangerous in our history. And it has a very long chapter on higher education. And there's this new mentality. It's sort of a Lord of the Flies mentality that once you're tagged, they chase you around the island and everyone joins in. And it's really appalling to watch. Many professors today are objecting that they've been targeted due to the pro-Palestinian protests. But these protesters, while these professors, I support them in the right to speak, they've been silent for decades as their colleagues have been fired. Many schools have purged all conservatives, libertarians, Republicans. There's some that have not a single Republican or conservative on the faculty. That's the way it works. And so Eastman was tagged, and immediately it became verboten for anyone to raise any concerns about his case. And I thought that the Carter opinion was appalling. The thing is, there's very little willingness to acknowledge the implications of the Eastman case. You can disagree with Eastman. I disagreed with some of his views that came out on January 6th. I disagreed with President Trump on that day about his view of what Vice President Pence could do. But those are disagreements. There are lots of times where minority views, even remote, even extreme views, are ultimately embraced. That's the point of the legal system. You allow these things to be argued, but there's a pile on. And it's very consistent with what we see in higher education, where people are tagged, shunned, isolated, and often fired.
Yeah, so I will venture this comment about it because I don't talk about the judge or John or Irwin, but I'm disappointed that Irwin has been silent because they worked together for years on this show. They did the circuit, going to the judicial circuit conferences and did Supreme Court review. And what has happened to John is appalling, but I don't talk about it because of my priors. Let me go to your book. One of the great things about the Indispensable Right is that it's for laymen, and it is written in short chapters so that they can learn about John Peter Zenger, and they can learn about Madison and the fact this was the Third Amendment, not the first, but it became. They'll learn all that stuff in a way that a layman can. But let me tell you what I didn't know about. I didn't know about the Freeze Rebellion. I don't think I've ever read about the Freeze Rebellion, and I have read about the Revolutionary period for as long as I've been alive. How did you find that?
Well, what's interesting, Hugh, is that, I referred to this as the Age of Rage many years ago at the beginning of the Trump administration. And it wasn't meant to suggest that it was our first Age of Rage. We've had these periods in which people have been afraid and angry, and free speech has often been the first victim. But there is this crushing irony in these early rebellions, Whiskey and Freeze and other rebellions, because John Adams was a revolutionary who praised the Boston Tea Party. Let's keep in mind that, this country was born in rage. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. And when these citizens took up this protest and ultimately destroyed that tea, they did so in the name of independence, but it was also a criminal act. It was also an act of rage. And John Adams praised it. He said it was majestic and magnificent. He wrote this long statement about how wonderful it was to see this happen. When he became the president, he immediately sought to arrest all of his political opponents, and he denounced anyone who was expressing this types of rage. Well, when you look at these rebellions, Freeze or Whiskey, for example, they were used by the Federalists as a way to crack down on dissidents. Now, they keep in mind that they were abusing revolutionary soldiers. One of the amazing things about this is that Freeze and in the Whiskey Rebellion, you had people who were decorated, honored revolutionary soldiers who took up these causes. And by the way, they really weren't rebelling. These were basically protests against taxes. So what you have to keep in mind is back then, Congress wasn't printing out currency. It wasn't producing coin. But they insisted that everyone pay their taxes in coin. And people just didn't have it. So when you look at things like the Whiskey Rebellion, whiskey wasn't just some fun drink that people didn't want to part with. it was the currency in Pennsylvania because they didn't have coin. And it was cheaper for them to convert crops into whiskey because they had to go over the Allegheny to sell it. And they could sell a lot more if they reduced it to whiskey. But we're talking about pennies of difference. So when the government came in and said, pay us in coin, a lot of these veterans said, why don't you pay us then what you owe me in coin for our service, and then we'll pay you your taxes? And they said, that's not the point. Pay up or we'll take your cow, we'll take your home. That's why these so-called rebellions occurred. And the effort was actually quite peaceful for most of these protests. But the Adams folks and the Federalist folks saw their chance to assert federal authority, and people like Alexander Hamilton was behind all of this. You know, it was Hamilton that came up with the whiskey tax. You know, this was an effort to pay for the new capital, and it favored large producers of whiskey against these small producers. Well, these small producers, that's all there were in parts of Pennsylvania. And
you know, when I read that part, Professor, I think Charles Beard was clapping from beyond. But when we come back from break, there's 4 minutes. Would you tell people about Matthew Lyon and Roger Griswold mixing it up on the House floor? I never knew about the Lyon trial until I read The Indispensable Right. So kudos on that one as well. I didn't know they had a fist fight. I know about Sumner and Preston coming over with the caning before the Supreme Court. But this is, what year is this? This is early Federalist era, isn't it?
Hi, Hugh. You're breaking up a little bit. I'm sorry, our connection is not the greatest. But yes, I mean, the interesting thing about this trial is it just shows you the extent to which free speech has been curtailed in the United States. And this was pure political speech. And it even spilled over to Congress, where you had this fist fight. And the subsequent prosecutions that occurred, even of members of Congress. And this was really sort of the signature, of course, of the Adams administration, but continued on through the Lincoln administration. You had copperheads who were arrested during the Lincoln administration for speaking out against the war, including people who were not in favor of slavery and were not in favor of the South. But it gives an idea of how we've continued to struggle with free speech, because even though everyone agrees with Louis Brandeis that free speech is indispensable, they can't seem to agree on why it's indispensable. And the reason this book suggests is because it's a natural right. It is a right given by God. It's a right that belongs to all human beings. So when you look at the sort of Lyons case, you see how easy it is to get on the slippery slope where pure political speech is treated as sedition. And also how many judges in the early republic were openly partisan, that they just defined people who spoke against the government, who had unpopular views, as seditionists, much in the same way that everyone is sort of labeled an insurrectionist today.
So, Professor Turley, I want people to go to page 113 in the bookstore of The Indispensable Right, just to look at the cartoon, and then take it to the bookstore checkout or go to Amazon. The illustrations are magnificent, by the way, in The Indispensable Right. I think you must have gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that the book is as well illustrated as it is explained. Professor, Justice Breyer came to the studio about a dozen years ago, and we had a debate about the First Amendment. And I read to him a piece of the Massachusetts Ratification Convention where a Mr. Smith got up and said, "Mr. President, I am a plain man and I get my living by the plow. I'm not used to speaking in public, but I beg your leave to say a few words to my brother plow joggers' house." He goes on to say, "I found the Constitution as a cure for our disorders. It was just such a thing as I wanted. I got a copy of it and read it over and over. I have been a member of constitutions for our own state constitution, learned something of checks and balances. I found them all there, and I did not go to any lawyer to ask his opinion. We have no lawyers in our town, and we do well enough without. I formed my own opinion. I'm pleased with this Constitution." Now, Professor, what was the understanding, because it comes up yesterday in Murthy, What was the understanding at the time of the framing of what free speech was, and then 3 years later when the amendment is ratified?
Well, first of all, there's something that I've often emphasized, because the anti-free speech movement constantly says that we don't have a free speech problem because these are private companies involved in limitation of free speech, and I go into that in the book. I really, Joe Biden is, in my view, the most anti-free speech president since John Adams. He
Oh my.
has His administration has sustained the largest censorship system we've ever had in this country, and certainly the most effective. And they've done that through grants and funding of academic groups and corporate groups. And one of the reasons this is the most dangerous period we're facing is that we've never had this alliance against free speech. You know, the media, academia are usually defenders of free speech. They become some of its greatest antagonists, and they are combining with corporate and government allies. And the result has been chilling, where a judge referred to this as perfectly Orwellian. And so, one of the things I emphasize is that it is a spin when people say, well, it's not a free speech issue because these are private companies doing this. First of all, free speech is not entirely encased within the First Amendment. The First Amendment was designed to deal with the most prevalent and dangerous threat to free speech, that of government direct censorship. But free speech goes beyond that. It's embodied in that document. It's embodied in the writings of the framers, because I believe that they did recognize it as a human right, as a natural right, and that was before the courts started to apply this slippery slope approach to free speech. And that's why we have struggled with it throughout all of these periods. So when you look at what's happening on the internet, I've testified in Congress that this is really censorship by surrogate. It's censorship in which the government does indirectly what it's prohibited from doing directly. So many of us had really hoped that the Supreme Court would deal with this issue, to set aside this nonsense, to clarify how free speech is protected, even when the government uses partners in academia and the corporate world. Instead, Justice Barrett took an off ramp, and it's clear that the court was struggling with the issue. And so she allowed the perfect to be the enemy of the good, and said, well, these are not the right parties to raise this issue.
She punted.
Then
She punted. The Chief
she
Justice and I
did.
were colleagues in the White House counsel's office years ago. He may be the smartest man I've met, along with former President Nixon and Mitt Romney. I mean, very, very smart. But they punt whenever they want to avoid an election year issue. Murthy is a big punt, isn't it? We haven't solved this issue.
Yeah, I think that they do, and we saw that we're going to see that in the abortion case, which was accidentally posted, where they just said this was a case of us improvidently granting this, so we're just going to send back and pretend we didn't accept it. The problem, of course, and I think Alito is absolutely right in his dissent. He said, look, this is one of the most important cases ever to come before this court. And he's absolutely correct. That is what the Biden administration is doing, is gutting the First Amendment, gutting free speech from within. They have created a way to do indirectly what the framers wanted to bar being done directly. And they've been really successful. And the fascinating thing is that it was the left, and the book talks about this, that was the target during the McCarthy period. They were the ones being fired, censored, blacklisted. They were the ones where the government was trying to keep revenue from going to programs and individuals. And they have taken up all those tools now and have used it against the right. But they are so much more successful than McCarthy ever was. I mean, they have
Joe McCarthy.
created,
Yep.
right, I'm sorry, and they have created an echo chamber in media and academia that excludes opposing voices.
My hat is off to you because you did not shy away from anything, from January 6th, from Donald Trump, from John Eastman, from Erwin Chemerinsky. You did not spare any of the academics, whether it's Barbara McQuaid, who's teaching at my alma mater, and I think she's wrong pretty much every time she talks on MSNBC. I love everything you've done in this book. What I want to have you explain to me, because I am struggling with the anti-Semitic outbursts across the country, with the assaults. You know, there was murder of a man, a Charlottesville on the West Coast in Los Angeles. There was basically a rolling pogrom in Los Angeles over the weekend at a shoal. There was a beatdown of a Jewish parent at a Brooklyn public school this week. And I know Brandenburg, but I want you to explain what the rule is about really noxious and potentially alarming speech that just falls short of assault. Can you explain to him what our attitude ought to be, even to the speech we find the most offensive, provided it's not crossing the Brandenburg line?
Well, Brandenburg is one of the things I've often talked about, including in the book, of why I believe the prosecutions by Jack Smith of President Trump for his January 6th speech are flagrantly unconstitutional. You can disagree with the president in his speech. I was doing the coverage on that day. I disagreed with aspects of that speech, but it is absolutely protected. And the reason is that under Brandenburg, you cannot criminalize speech unless it has a threat of imminent violence. That is, it has to be something where violence follows, but is also sort of carrying forth, crossing that line, getting people to be violent. President Trump, even though it was omitted by the January 6th committee repeatedly when they quoted him, said go peacefully to Capitol Hill. It happens all the time. People go to state and federal capitals to protest what's happening inside. And what happened here is that a protest became a riot. It wasn't an insurrection, it was a riot. And the Capitol was poorly defended. During the coverage, I remarked before the violence began, I just blurted out, I've never seen the Capitol so thinly protected, because our cameras were picking up entrance points where you had, bicycle cops, a few of them standing in front of hundreds of protesters. So this does not meet the Brandenburg test. People are allowed to be rageful. They're allowed to express rage rhetoric. It is protected, even for the President of the United States.
It was the best defense of President Trump's January 6th speech I've seen in print. I share your views completely. I originally called it insurrection on the day of, but then I switched to riot because it was a riot. It was a demonstration that became a riot. Those are your words. But the thing I'm getting at is, what is the court going to say about attempts to deal with the anti-Semitic violence in the United States, like that pogrom? Do they fall back on Brandenburg? Is that sufficient to the danger we have right now of 10 million migrants, 400 of whom are on suspected ISIS watch lists? Because I think we're getting close to another Red Scare. I think we're getting close to another McCarthy era, to another Palmer raid, to another Biddle era. You took Francis Biddle to the cleaners. Good for you. But what do you think the court? What do you think the court's going to do about this? The violence at Columbia, the violence at Northwestern. I think you're a Northwestern grad. The violence at UCLA. It's everywhere. At Michigan. What are they going to do about this?
Well, what's interesting is that this book took 30 years to write because I didn't want to produce the book until I could understand and explain what free speech is, but also how dangerous the period we're living in, but how we get out of it. How do we have a reawakening in this country to embrace this right? And how do we reverse these trends in higher education, the media, and politics? And part of that is also, where do we draw the line, Hugh, that you are discussing now? And one of the things that I emphasize is that you really punish the conduct, not the speech. And so, for example, the book suggests we get away from sedition, conspiracy, and sedition crimes. We have had a sedition addiction in this country. We need to punish the acts themselves. Of course, people should be prosecuted for breaking into the Capitol and any property damage, for trespass and other offenses. That's conduct. And yes, of course, and this is another spin from the anti-free speech movement in response to this book, is they say, oh, well, Turley says don't punish speech, but some crimes are speech. Well, yeah, I mean, you can have a conspiracy to build a bomb by talking about the bomb and building the bomb. But the conspiracy is linked to carrying out that act. That's different from expressing political viewpoints. Like when the president says, go to the Capitol peacefully and get them to not certify the election. You can disagree with what he was saying, but it was not an insurrection. So on our campuses, we need to really start to enforce our rules. The chapter I have in higher education really takes
Yep.
Northwestern to task. I'm a graduate of University of Chicago as well as Northwestern. Chicago has been great. University of Chicago has a great free speech tradition. Northwestern is one of the worst in the countries because they turned their campuses over to the students. They don't enforce it. They allow people to cancel or what they call deplatform speakers, and they don't do anything about it. You need to start to suspend and expel students that are interrupting classes and events to prevent others from being heard.
Now, let's close, Professor, by talking a little bit about two things. Abraham Lincoln, who you take to task for his unconstitutional suspension of habeas corpus, we agree. Times of war, times of war. What did Cicero say? In times of war, the laws are silent. They certainly were in the Civil War. But you also, at the end of the book, say we might be on the edge of a renewal of a commitment to free speech, but it's got to start, and you were careful to say, in the secondary and higher education. Secondary education caught my eye because it's become quite adverse to speech. And indeed, government speech is being jammed down people's throats at some public institutions. Do you expect this court to take a stand for speech in academia and especially in the secondary public schools of America?
Yes, Hugh. I'm sorry we're breaking up again a little bit because of our connection. I hope you can hear me. But
We
yeah,
hear you
much of the
perfectly.
book talks about the okay, much of the book talks about how this anti-free speech movement began in our schools, both secondary and in higher education. And if we're going to have this reawakening, we've got to retake our educational system. And parents are doing that by voting with their feet. You know, they've been treated as a captive audience in secondary education. And they're using vouchers and private schools and homeschooling. And they're saying, forget it. You know, we're not going to allow you to sort of just take our kids and say that we have to accept these agendas. In higher education, the federal government needs to peg federal funding to what I lay out as 10 principles for free speech. If your university is engaging in racial discrimination, no one would suggest that we should give you federal funding. We should do the same thing with free speech. If you're denying citizens free speech, if you are harassing those that have opposing views, then do it without federal funds. And state governments need to do the same with state universities. State academics have purged conservatives, Republicans from their faculty, created this orthodox environment, this echo chamber, and yet they still go into vapors when there's any suggestion that the public shouldn't continue to fund them for that. Well, the public has a right to say, look, if you're going to create this echo chamber, do it without our money. So we can take back these universities to have greater balance. It just takes the political will and ultimately, I hope, a reawakening of citizens.
My very last question to you, Professor Turley. I want to put up the portrait of Norman Rockwell's Vermont man. And Harley, if you've got that there, throw it up, because you are confident that free speech is in the DNA of America, and you kind of refer to this Norman Rockwell. Now, you like modern art, and I don't, but tell us why you love this picture and what it represents.
You know, I love the picture because, as I say in the book, I'm unapologetically Rockwellian when it comes to the Constitution. I talk about the picture because it became the very basis of our war bonds campaign. Rockwell's embodiment of free speech. This was a neighbor of Rockwell who stood up in a Vermont meeting and said something quite unpopular about paying for a new school. And Rockwell recognized it as that's the essence. That's who we are. That's the United States of America. That man standing up alone in a small meeting house in Vermont and saying what he had to say. And Rockwell was attacked by art connoisseurs One of them said he's just decided not to be taken seriously, and they argued that his art was kitsch, his art was shallow, and of course it's not. The Rockwell was popular and continues to be popular with many of us because these simple images to some hold profound meaning. You look at that picture and you understand. Just like the First Amendment is short, it just says you can't abridge free speech. But Americans get a profound meaning from that. And that's what's escaping all of the anti-free speech critics, is that it's not simplistic. It's profound in its implications. And so, yes, I am a Rockwellian when it comes to constitutional law. I believe it is simple and profound. And we only got into trouble in our republic when we walked away from that basic, simple truth that free speech belongs to us, that we need it as humans to be fully human. And if we have that Rockwellian view, I think the power of the U.S. Constitution and what makes it so unique, what makes us unique as a people, really comes through.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor, from Antigone and Sophocles and Socrates taking the hemlock right up through January 6th and Jack Smith's prosecution. The Indispensable Right really is the indispensable book for a layman who wants to know how we ended up here and how we get out. Jonathan Turley, great to have you on the program. Come back, and congratulations on the book. You must be exhausted doing con law analysis and then doing the book tour and Gutfeld at night and Hugh in the morning. So thank you. Have a very good day.
Thank you. It was a great honor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.